Faria, a world of mystery and danger. It's a pretty obscure NES action RPG, and not only is it obscure, it's very hard to find and actually pretty expensive nowadays. Is it worth the massive price it commands? Not really, no. But we'll get to that in a sec. The story itself is a fairly generic RPG plot, having to do with prophecies and hidden scrolls, but before any of that, your first task is to go and find the missing princess. Once you finally return with the princess, you are told that your reward of being able to marry her has now been rescinded because you are a woman. So, way to be progressive, Japan. Also, when I was told to go and get this girl, I was shown a picture of this caterpillar. When I found this caterpillar, it turns out this was not the princess, because this is in fact the princess. So way to not be helpful, game. So instead of being able to marry the princess, instead the king has a massive party in your honor, where everyone eats caviar the king bought 2 days prior from a masked man he'd never met, and then everyone gets sick. Because it was poisoned. I think the king is just covering his ass here. I don't think it was actually poisoned, I think it was the king's a massive dumbass for leaving a bunch of fish-based products in the open air for 2 days. It's called refrigeration. Come on, king guy. And from here on out, you are sent to heal the villagers from the king's idiocy, as well as go fight monsters and save the world. Or something. Yeah, aside from the fact that the king essentially poisons everyone with his own idiocy, the plot itself isn't really all that noteworthy. How's the gameplay? Well, at best it's tedious, and at worst it's downright cruel. As soon as you start, if you leave town and enter a battle, you are screwed. You have 0 ways of defending yourself. Alright, I'm used to some RPGs starting you out with 0 equipment, but the thing is, you start out with nothing. You don't even have a way to punch monsters. If you end up in a fight, you pretty much have to restart, which makes this whole thing a very big rookie trap. But the thing about it is, you can't even really recover from this trap. If you lose in a fight with monsters, you're going to lose a lot of your money, which means you can't even go and buy your initial equipment. Also, if you run from a fight, you have a high chance of losing money. Not just that, you have a chance of losing experience. Why exactly would you want to walk away from a fight? It's an RPG. Well, the thing is, fighting in this game is not very good. Enemies really come down to 2 basic AI patterns. They either wander around the map aimlessly, or they charge straight at you. Now the first ones can be a little tricky to deal with, but the second ones are the real danger. Because if they charge at you in large numbers, even if you attack them and knock them back, some of them still might get through your attack and cause great amounts of damage to you. And even with armor and shielding, you can lose health really quickly, especially if you're not highly leveled. In order to level, you're going to have to grind. And I have to emphasize this a lot, this game has a lot of grinding in it. And it's not good, like at all, because again, you're fighting the same generic enemies over and over again, because if you step in even the wrong squares, you can get ambushed by enemies that will just annihilate you. Like very early on, the forest outside the initial town actually contains enemies that are completely invisible to you. Now later in the game you actually get a way to counteract their invisibility, but prior they will just stomp on you very, very hard, and then take your money, and then you can't buy equipment, and then you're screwed. So not only are you required to grind, but you're forced to grind in very, very controlled environments, with very little experimentation to see where you can go, because if you push the limits, you're probably going to get smashed, and if you get smashed, you lose pretty much any progress you may have made, because you won't be able to buy new equipment. Likewise, even if you're capable of buying new equipment, it's not exactly great at conveying exactly how powerful the equipment is. The only thing I could really find to help delineate the strength of equipment was simply based on how much one piece of equipment cost versus another piece of equipment. And that's not very good. But this is an RPG, there's more to it than just fighting monsters and progressing a story, right? There's gotta be dungeons, and yeah, there are, but they're also kind of awful. See, most dungeons are very, very cramped spaces, filled often with the enemies that like to rush you, which goes back to them getting through your defenses and basically destroying you. But more importantly is, they are very, very confusing to navigate. Like, for example, let's just use the first dungeon for the sake of easiness because that's what I've got recorded. I talked to literally every character prior to tackling this dungeon. The only piece of information I was armed with at this point, despite talking to everyone, was that this tower has 3 statues. Now the good thing is, very early on you run into one of these statues, and you have to deal with it before you can progress, and you learn that pushing a statue will open doors. Okay, that's not too bad, except that there are 3 statues, and there's like a dozen doors in here, with half of them being affected by one statue and the other being affected by the other half, with the first statue only affecting the front door. So basically, you're running around these very tight corridors, getting jumped by monsters that are way too powerful, in way too high a number, just trying to figure out where these statues are and what doors correspond to them. And that's not even the half of it, because the dungeons all have a singular tile set, which means every room you go into is going to look the exact same versus every other one. And they're designed like mazes, so even if you charted the dungeon out with graph paper, you'd still be incredibly lost. Case in point, I did so. And I was stuck on this dungeon, again the first dungeon, and that wasn't including time I spent grinding in between, for a total of like 2 hours. It's painful. Just painful to play this game. And it's a shame too, because while the combat mechanics are very basic, they're responsive and work well enough, but everything else about the game just feels like it's trying to be as stacked against you as possible, so that you sit around and grind over and over and over, hoping that you have enough health to try and tackle a dungeon, and just happen to be psychic enough to figure out how they're laid out. And that's not good, not even remotely close. Now, the presentation of Faria is kind of a mixed bag. Visually, it's not too bad. The overworld sprites and everything work for what they need to do, but what really impressed me were the portraits. Because, for the most part, they all look great. Except for this one. Like, seriously, what is up with this? It looks like an old man, but his eyes have exploded or something. Like, I can't wrap my head around this one. But the rest of the portraits all look fantastic. Now, on the other side of presentation is, of course, audio, and that's where this game stumbles a little bit. The audio isn't remotely memorable, or really all that interesting, which is a shame because that could really complement the visual design, and at least give me something more in depth to positively talk about this game. But, unfortunately not. And I think that's actually a pretty good analogy for Faria. It feels like a lot of missed opportunity. The basic combat in this game works well, but everything else that's built around it just falls short in every single way. It feels like it's trying so desperately to just beat you down with grinding and hopefully not dying, so you have to try and get all your money back just so you can buy equipment that may or may not even help you. And to get you just baffled by the overall dungeon layouts, it feels like it's just trying to take as much time out of your life as possible, as opposed to telling an engaging story or having a really memorable adventure. And that's a real shame. Now, if you really want a copy of Faria, be prepared to pay an arm and a leg for it, because it costs quite a lot. Now, if you want a Japanese copy, you can actually get it for about $10 or less, which is far more affordable. But it's also an RPG, so you're gonna have to deal with a lot of text. Although this game is moderately straightforward, so you might not necessarily even need it, especially considering how helpful the actual text in this game is. So, you know, if you're interested, you might as well, just for how much money you'll save on it. But honestly, if you want an action RPG on the NES, I would much more eagerly recommend you go play Magic of Sahara-Zod, or, and this is going to be the second episode in a row I point this out, Crystalis, because it's kind of the best game on the system, and it's an excellent action RPG. But unless you have a lot of money to burn, I would suggest skipping out on Faria, a world of grinding and tedium, because while it has a lot of potential, it feels like it missed way too many notes to be worthwhile.